The mistreatment of an employee unravels into a scandalous affair, exposing secrets that could tear a family apart. And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The 47th floor of the Prescott Tower buzzed with nervous energy as employees rushed to prepare for the morning presentation. The clock struck 9 a.m., and Tyler Prescott's leather shoes clicked against the marble floor as he strode into the conference room. His presence immediately commanded attention, causing the room to fall silent. Jake Miller stood at the front, his presentation materials spread across the glass table. As a senior designer with 5 years at the company, he had handled countless presentations, but something felt different today. The air conditioning hummed overhead as he began his pitch for the new marketing campaign. 3 slides in, Tyler raised his hand, cutting Jake off mid-sentence. "This is amateur work," Tyler declared, his voice carrying across the room. "The color scheme is outdated, the typography is inconsistent, and frankly, I expected better from someone at your level." He stood up, walking to the screen. "Look at this layout. It's something a first-year design student would produce." The other executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Sarah Prescott, seated at the far end of the table, gripped her pen tighter with each word her husband spoke. She watched Jake's face redden as Tyler continued his critique, methodically dismantling every aspect of the presentation. "I don't understand how you thought this was acceptable," Tyler continued, his voice growing harder. "Do you think our clients pay premium rates for mediocre work? Do you think the Prescott name was built on presentations that look like they were thrown together last minute?" Jake stood rooted to the spot, his knuckles white against the presentation remote. The projector hummed in the background as Tyler circled him like a shark. 20 pairs of eyes watched the scene unfold, none daring to intervene. "I apologize, Mr. Prescott," Jake managed to say, his voice steady despite the humiliation. "I can revise the design and have it ready by—" "Don't bother," Tyler cut him off. "Give the project to Amanda's team. At least they understand our standards." He turned to the room. Meeting dismissed. As chairs scraped against the floor and people filed out, Jake gathered his materials with mechanical precision. Sarah lingered, watching him maintain his composure even as his hands trembled slightly while collecting his laptop. In his office, Jake sat at his desk, staring at the New York skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. 5 years of dedication, countless late nights, and successful campaigns meant nothing in the face of Tyler's arbitrary standards. His computer screen showed dozens of iterations of the presentation he'd worked on for weeks, each one meeting every requirement in the brief. He opened his drawer, pulling out a small notebook filled with sketches and ideas for his own design agency, dreams he'd put aside to climb the corporate ladder at Prescott Advertising. The morning's humiliation forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. He'd sacrificed his creative freedom for the security of a prestigious position. Sarah observed Jake from her office across the hall. She recognized the look of defeated resignation on his face. She'd seen it in her own reflection too many times. Her marriage to Tyler had become a carefully choreographed performance, each playing their assigned roles in public while growing increasingly distant in private. She thought about approaching Jake, offering some words of comfort or support, but hesitated. Office politics at Prescott were complicated enough without the CEO's wife appearing to take sides against him. Instead, she watched as Jake straightened his desk, adjusted his tie, and visibly steeled himself to face the rest of the day. The incident rippled through the office. Whispered conversations stopped when Tyler passed by, and Jake's colleagues gave him a wide berth, afraid of being associated with someone who had fallen from grace. The dynamic shifted, creating invisible lines between those loyal to Tyler and those who sympathized with Jake. As the day wound down, Jake made a decision. He opened his computer and began working on a new version of the presentation, not to appease Tyler, but to prove to himself that he hadn't lost his creative edge. Sarah noticed the light in his office, staying on long after most employees had left, and something about his determination stirred something in her she thought she'd buried long ago. The scene set the stage for a complex web of relationships and power dynamics that would soon unravel in unexpected ways, testing loyalties and forcing each character to confront their true desires and motivations. Le Bernardine's soft lighting cast elegant shadows across the white tablecloth as Sarah watched Tyler check his phone for the fourth time since their appetizers arrived. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of fine china, a stark contrast to the tension at their table. "The Wilson account is proving difficult," Tyler said, not looking up from his screen. "Their demands are becoming unreasonable." He placed his phone face up on the table, clearly expecting more messages. Sarah took a measured sip of her wine, a 2015 Bordeaux that Tyler had ordered without consulting her. "I thought this was supposed to be our evening," she said, keeping her voice level. "We haven't had a proper dinner together in 3 weeks." The waiter appeared with their main courses, Dover sole for Sarah, Wagyu beef for Tyler. As he arranged the plates with practiced precision, Tyler finally tucked his phone away, though Sarah noticed how it remained within easy reach. "You know how crucial this period is for the company," Tyler replied, cutting into his steak. "The merger with Eastern Digital could double our market share. These opportunities don't come along every day." Sarah placed her fork down, studying her husband's face. The sharp angles of his jawline had hardened over the years, matching his increasingly rigid personality. "When was the last time we talked about something other than work?" she asked. "Do you remember what we used to discuss when we first met?" Tyler paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. For a moment, something softened in his expression. "We were different people then, Sarah. We've grown, evolved. This is what success looks like." "Is it?" Sarah challenged, gesturing to the empty table surrounding them. Their standard reservation was so late that most diners had already left. Sitting in expensive restaurants at 10 p.m., barely speaking to each other. "You knew what you were signing up for when you married me," Tyler said, his tone sharpening. "The Prescott name comes with certain responsibilities, certain sacrifices." Sarah felt the familiar weight of disappointment settle in her chest. "I married a man who had dreams, Tyler, not just ambitions. There's a difference." Their conversation was interrupted by Tyler's phone vibrating against the table. He reached for it immediately, but Sarah was faster. She placed her hand over the device, forcing him to meet her eyes. "What do you want from me, Sarah?" Tyler asked, frustration evident in his voice. "I've given you everything, the penthouse, the summer house in the Hamptons, access to the best of everything. What more could you possibly need?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken answers. Sarah withdrew her hand, allowing Tyler to check his message. As he became absorbed in his phone again, she felt her own device buzz in her purse. Opening it discreetly under the table, she saw a message from Jake. "I need to talk to you. Coffee tomorrow? Nothing work-related, I promise." Sarah stared at the message, feeling her heart rate quicken. She thought about Jake's face during the morning's humiliation, the quiet dignity he'd maintained, and the creative fire she'd observed as he worked late into the evening. Here was someone who still had dreams, not just goals. "Everything all right?" Tyler asked, noticing her distraction. Sarah locked her phone screen, sliding it back into her purse. "Just a reminder about tomorrow's charity board meeting." She lied smoothly, the deception coming easier than she expected. As they finished their meal in familiar silence, Sarah composed and deleted several responses to Jake in her mind. Each version struggled between propriety and desire, between the safe confines of her marriage and the dangerous allure of genuine connection. Finally, as Tyler signed the check without looking at the amount, Sarah made her decision. Under the table, she typed a quick response to Jake. 1 p.m. The coffee shop on Sullivan Street. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of practiced motions. The car ride home, the perfunctory kiss goodnight, the sound of Tyler's study door closing as he returned to his work. Sarah stood at their bedroom window, looking out over the city lights, feeling simultaneously trapped and on the verge of something transformative. Her phone felt heavy in her hand as she reread Jake's message. Tomorrow would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. The question was whether she was ready for that change, and what it would cost her in the end. The coffee shop on Sullivan Street existed in stark contrast to the formal restaurants Sarah usually frequented. Exposed brick walls, mismatched furniture, and the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee created an atmosphere of comfortable authenticity. Sarah arrived first, choosing a secluded corner table away from the windows. Jake entered at precisely 1 p.m., his business attire replaced by dark jeans and a gray sweater. The casual clothing suited him, softening the corporate edge she was used to seeing. He ordered 2 coffees before joining her, having remembered her preference for oat milk lattes from previous office interactions. "Thank you for coming," Jake said, settling into the worn leather chair across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic mug, using it as an anchor. "I wasn't sure I would either," she admitted. The honesty felt foreign but refreshing. "How are you holding up after yesterday?" Jake's laugh held a touch of bitterness. "You mean after your husband's public dissection of my professional abilities? I've had better days." "Tyler can be intense," Sarah offered, knowing the word was inadequate. "Intense as a thunderstorm," Jake replied. "Tyler is more like a controlled demolition." He paused, studying her face. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't speak about him that way to you." Sarah shook her head. "No, please. It's refreshing to hear someone speak honestly. Everyone around me is so careful with their words, always calculating how they might get back to Tyler." "Is that why you came? To hear someone speak honestly?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Sarah took a sip of her coffee, buying time to formulate her response. "I came because I'm tired of carefully crafted conversations and strategic silences. Because watching what happened yesterday made me realize how much I've compromised to maintain an illusion of perfection." Jake leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Do you remember the first time we met? At the company holiday party last year? You were telling that story about backpacking through Europe before college, and your whole face lit up. I haven't seen that light since." "Tyler says those were childish dreams," Sarah said softly. "That real success requires focus, discipline." "And what do you say?" The question struck her with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had asked for her opinion rather than assuming it aligned with Tyler's? "I say," she began, then stopped, surprised by the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I say I'm tired of being Mrs. Tyler Prescott, of being an accessory to someone else's ambition." Jake reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. "You're not an accessory, Sarah. You're—" He trailed off, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities. Sarah found herself studying his face, the genuine concern in his eyes, the slight furrow of his brow, the way he leaned toward her as if drawn by an invisible force. "I'm what?" she whispered. Instead of answering, Jake closed the distance between them, his hand gently covering hers. The touch was electric, sending shivers up her arm. Their eyes met, and the bustling coffee shop seemed to fade away. Without conscious thought, Sarah found herself leaning forward. Jake's free hand came up to cup her cheek, and then they were kissing. It was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened with years of pent-up emotion. Her frustration, his admiration, their shared loneliness. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah felt dizzy with conflicting emotions. Guilt warred with exhilaration, shame with a sense of rightness she hadn't felt in years. "I should go," she said, but made no move to leave. "Should you?" Jake asked quietly. "Or is that just what Tyler's voice in your head is telling you to do?" The question hit home. Sarah realized she'd spent so long living according to Tyler's expectations that she'd almost forgotten how to recognize her own desires. "I don't know what I want anymore," she admitted. Jake squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe that's exactly what you need to figure out, without anyone else's influence." They sat in charged silence, their coffee growing cold, both aware that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The kiss had changed everything, transforming theoretical attraction into tangible reality. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, more to herself than to Jake. "Whatever you want to happen," Jake replied. "For once, this is completely your choice." The weight of that freedom both terrified and thrilled her. As they finally prepared to leave the coffee shop, Sarah knew her life had irreversibly shifted course. The only question was where this new path would lead, and whether she was brave enough to follow it. Tyler Prescott's corner office became increasingly suffocating as he scrolled through Sarah's credit card statements. 3 coffee shops in a week, none near their usual haunts. Lunch charges at casual restaurants she'd normally avoid. Small inconsistencies that painted a larger picture of deception. She's been different lately, he muttered, more to himself than to Mark Stevens, who lounged in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. Mark, Tyler's CFO and oldest friend, raised an eyebrow. Different how? His tone was carefully neutral, but his eyes showed keen interest. Distracted. Coming home late. Making excuses about charity events I know aren't scheduled. Tyler stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows. 47 floors below, New York City continued its relentless pace. Last night, she was smiling at her phone during dinner. Sarah never smiles at her phone. Mark straightened in his chair, sensing an opportunity. Have you considered having her followed? Tyler turned sharply. What kind of man has his wife followed? The kind who has built an empire and needs to protect it, Mark replied smoothly. Marriage contracts can be expensive to dissolve, especially in your position. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, toxic but compelling. Tyler returned to his desk, pulling up the company's organizational chart on his computer. Who would have reason to interact with her regularly? Anyone new in her charity committee? Mark stood, walking to the desk with calculated casualness. Actually, I've noticed something interesting in the design department. He paused for effect. Jake Miller has been TAC. ING extended lunches lately. Coincidentally, around the same time Sarah's been out. Tyler's fingers tightened on his mouse. Jake Miller? The same Jake Miller who couldn't put together a decent presentation to save his life. The same, Mark confirmed, watching Tyler's reaction carefully. Though some might say your criticism of that presentation was unnecessarily harsh. Are you suggesting I drove my wife into another man's arms through tough management? Mark raised his hands defensively. I'm not suggesting anything, just sharing observations. As your friend. Meanwhile, in her office, Sarah sat staring at her phone, where Jake's latest message glowed on the screen. Missing you already. Lunch tomorrow. Her finger hovered over the reply button, guilt and desire waging their familiar war. A knock at her door made her jump. Mark Stevens entered without waiting for a response, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Sarah, lovely to see you, he said, closing the door behind him. I was hoping to catch you alone. Sarah locked her phone, placing it face down on her desk. What can I help you with, Mark? Oh, I was just wondering how you're holding up. It can't be easy being caught between your husband and certain members of the staff. His emphasis on the last words made Sarah's blood run cold. I'm not sure what you mean, she replied, keeping her voice steady. Mark's smile widened fractionally. No, my mistake then. Though if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who understands the pressures of maintaining appearances, he let the offer hang unfinished. After Mark left, Sarah's hands shook as she typed a warning to Jake. Be careful. Mark suspects something. In his own office, Jake received the message with growing unease. He'd noticed Mark watching him lately, asking casual questions about his schedule, his projects, his future plans. Each interaction felt like a piece of evidence being collected. The day wore on, tension building like a thunderstorm. Tyler prowled the offices with barely contained anger, snapping at employees for minor infractions. Sarah maintained her composure through 2 board meetings, though her mind raced with contingency plans. Jake buried himself in work, trying to appear productive and innocent. As evening approached, Mark sat in his own office, reviewing the information he'd gathered. Years of resentment toward Tyler, for promotions denied, credit stolen, opportunities blocked, had finally presented him with the perfect weapon. The question was how best to use it. He opened his desk drawer, pulling out a file he'd been compiling. Inside were photos from the coffee shop on Sullivan Street, timestamps from security logs showing matching absences, and notes from conversations with strategic employees. Not enough to prove anything definitively, but more than enough to create doubt and discord. Sometimes, he murmured to himself, the threat of exposure is more valuable than exposure itself. The office slowly emptied, leaving behind a web of suspicion and fear. Tyler sat alone in his office, studying old photos of Sarah on his phone, trying to pinpoint the moment things had changed. Sarah drove home in silence, her usual NPR podcast forgotten as she weighed her options. Jake worked late again, partly from dedication and partly from fear of what awaited him outside the office's relative safety. And Mark, last to leave, smiled as he imagined the chaos to come. The pieces were in place. Now it was just a matter of timing. The evening light cast long shadows across the Prescott's penthouse as Tyler paced the living room, waiting for Sarah to return. When the elevator doors finally opened, he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette stark against the Manhattan skyline. "Another late meeting?" he asked, not turning around. Sarah set her bag down carefully, buying time. The Thompson Foundation needed to finalize the gala details. "Interesting," Tyler said, finally face-eyeing her. "Because I called Patricia Thompson an hour ago. She's in London." He moved to the bar, pouring himself 2 fingers of scotch. "Want to try again?" Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate, but kept her expression neutral. "I wasn't meeting with Patricia. I was meeting with her event coordinator." At 7 p.m., Tyler took a slow sip of his scotch. "You've never been a good liar, Sarah. It's one of the things I used to love about you." The use of past tense wasn't lost on her. "Are we really doing this now, Tyler? Interrogating me about my schedule when you can't even make it through dinner without checking your phone? Don't deflect. This isn't about me." He placed his glass down with deliberate control. "You've changed. The mysterious appointments, the different restaurants, the constant texting. Do you think I'm blind?" Sarah moved to the kitchen, needing physical distance. "Maybe I've changed. Maybe I'm tired of being the perfect corporate wife. Always available when you need arm candy, but invisible when you're closing deals." Meanwhile, across town, Mark sat across from Tyler at a dimly lit steakhouse, carefully planting seeds of doubt. "I hate bringing this up," Mark said, cutting into his ribeye, "but as your friend, I feel obligated. People are talking, Tyler." Tyler's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "About Sarah, the way she's been distant lately, the time she spends with certain employees." Mark watched Tyler's expression darken. "I'm sure it's nothing, but in your position, even rumors can be dangerous. What exactly are people saying?" Tyler's voice was dangerously quiet. Mark leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's been talk about her lunches with Jake Miller. Long ones in out-of-the-way places. The kind of restaurants where people don't recognize the CEO's wife." The manipulation worked its way into Tyler's mind like poison. Later that evening, Sarah found herself facing another confrontation. "Where were you really today?" Tyler demanded as soon as she walked in. "I told you I had don't." Tyler's voice cut through her explanation. "Don't insult both of us with another lie." In her pocket, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Jake. "We need to talk. Things are getting complicated." Sarah felt the walls closing in. Every lie, every secret meeting, every stolen moment was coming due with interest. "Tyler, I think we both know this isn't working anymore." "What isn't working? Our marriage? The life I've given you?" His laugh was bitter. "Or is it just that you found something more exciting?" Meanwhile, Jake sat in his apartment, staring at his sent message. He couldn't shake the feeling that Mark had been watching him all day, documenting his movements, gathering evidence. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Sarah and Jake managed to meet briefly the next day, finding a quiet moment in a small park several blocks from the office. "Mark knows," Jake said without preamble. "He's been collecting information, watching us. Today he asked me about my friendship with you." The way he said it, Sarah felt her carefully constructed world starting to crumble. "What are we going to do?" "Maybe," Jake hesitated. "Maybe we should end this before it destroys everything." Sarah studied his face, seeing the conflict there. "Is that what you want?" "What I want stopped matching the moment I fell in love with my boss's wife." The confession hung between them, too honest to take back, too dangerous to acknowledge fully. Sarah reached for his hand, then stopped herself, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. "We need to be smarter," she said finally. "More careful. Or braver," Jake replied softly. They parted ways, each feeling the weight of their decisions pressing down on them. Sarah returned home to find Tyler waiting, his suspicions now fed by Mark's careful hints and his own observations. Jake returned to his apartment to find an email from Mark, requesting a private meeting to discuss his future at the company. The game was shifting, the players making their moves, and the stakes growing higher with each passing day. Mark watched it all unfold, carefully orchestrating the chaos while maintaining his facade of concerned friend and colleague. The quarterly review meeting crackled with tension as Tyler stood at the head of the conference table. 50 of the company's top executives filled the room, but his focus zeroed in on Jake Miller, who sat reviewing his presentation notes. "Miller," Tyler's voice cut through the pre-meeting chatter. "You're up first today." Jake rose smoothly, though Sarah noticed his hand trembling slightly as he connected his laptop to the projector. The room fell silent, remembering the disaster of his last presentation. The Q3 campaign metrics show significant growth. Jake began, his voice steady despite Tyler's unwavering stare. The slides were flawless, clean, innovative, and backed by solid data. Tyler waited until Jake was halfway through before striking. "Stop." He stood, buttoning his jacket. "Does anyone else notice the fundamental flaw in this approach?" The room held its collective breath. Sarah gripped her pen tighter, watching Jake's face for any sign of breaking. "The entire strategy assumes our target demographic prioritizes sustainability," Tyler continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "Based on what data, Miller? Your personal feelings about the environment?" Jake stood his ground. "The market research is clear, Mr. Prescott. I can show you the market research you cherry-picked to support your predetermined conclusions." Tyler walked to the screen, his presence dominating the room. "This is what happens when we let ideology override business sense. When we allow personal agendas to infiltrate professional decisions." The double meaning wasn't lost on anyone. Several executives glanced uncomfortably between Tyler and Jake, while others studiously examined their notebooks. "The numbers speak for themselves," Jake replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Our test campaign showed a 47% increase in engagement when you manipulated the parameters to get the results you wanted." Tyler turned to face the room. "This is what weakness looks like. This is what happens when people forget their place, when they reach beyond their station." Sarah watched Jake's knuckles whiten against the podium. She could see the moment something snapped behind his eyes. "My place." Jake's voice was quiet, but carried clearly. "Is my place to be your punching bag? To watch you dismiss valid research because it doesn't match your preconceptions?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. No one challenged Tyler Prescott, especially not in front of the entire executive team. Tyler's smile was shark-like. "Your place, Mr. Miller, is wherever I say it is. Or nowhere in this company at all." "Then maybe it should be nowhere." Jake began gathering his materials. "Because I'd rather be unemployed than continue pretending your way is the only way." The silence was deafening as Jake walked toward the door. Sarah felt her heart pounding, knowing she should remain silent, but feeling the words build in her throat. "The presentation was excellent," she said clearly, causing Jake to pause at the door. "The research is solid, the strategy is innovative, and dismissing it without proper consideration is poor business judgment." Tyler turned slowly to face his wife, his expression dangerous. "Excuse me? You heard me." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Your personal vendetta is clouding your professional judgment, and everyone in this room knows it." Mark leaned forward in his chair, watching the scene unfold with barely concealed satisfaction. This was better than he could have orchestrated himself. Jake stood frozen by the door, caught between escape and bearing witness to this unprecedented moment. Other executives shifted uncomfortably, torn between their instinct to agree with Sarah and their fear of Tyler's reaction. Meeting adjourned. Tyler ground out, his voice vibrating with rage. "Everyone out, except you, Sarah, and you, Miller." As the room quickly emptied, Mark lingered, making a show of gathering his materials while watching the three remaining figures. The tension between them was palpable, charged with unspoken accusations and suppressed emotions. "This isn't about the presentation, is it, Tyler?" Sarah asked once the room was nearly empty. "No," Tyler replied coldly. "It's about loyalty, trust, things that apparently mean nothing to either of you." Jake moved back into the room, standing neither with Sarah nor apart from her, a positioning that spoke volumes. "Loyalty has to be earned," he said quietly. So does trust. The three stood in a triangle of tension, each aware that this moment would change everything. Outside the conference room, Mark pulled out his phone and began typing, a smile playing at his lips. The chaos he'd hoped for was unfolding perfectly, and he hadn't even had to light the final match. The executive floor fell silent as Sarah stood up from her chair in the crowded conference room. The quarterly shareholders' meeting had been tense enough, with Tyler presenting optimistic projections that felt hollow given the company's internal turmoil. But no one expected what came next. Before we conclude, Sarah's voice rang clear and steady. There's something that needs to be addressed. She looked directly at Tyler, who froze mid-sentence, marker still poised over the whiteboard. Sarah, Tyler warned, his tone carrying a clear threat. This isn't the time. It's exactly the time. She stepped away from the conference table, commanding the room's attention. For years, this company has operated on fear and manipulation. We've watched good people be crushed, innovative ideas dismissed, and toxic behavior rewarded. The shareholders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mark leaned forward, barely containing his satisfaction as he watched his carefully laid plans bear unexpected fruit. I've been complicit in this culture of silence, Sarah continued. As Tyler's wife, I've stood by while he created an environment where personal vendettas override sound business decisions. But that ends today. Tyler's marker clattered to the floor. If you do this, I'm in love with Jake Miller, Sarah announced, her voice unwavering. And before anyone dismisses this as merely a personal matter, let me be clear. Our relationship began because we both recognized the dysfunction at the heart of this company. The room erupted in whispers. Several board members exchanged meaningful glances, while others stared studiously at their tablets, avoiding eye contact. Tyler stood perfectly still, his face draining of color. The control he'd maintained so carefully for so long was slipping away in front of the people whose respect he'd built his empire upon. You think this makes you look strong? He finally managed, his voice rough. Admitting to an affair in front of our shareholders? No, Sarah replied. What makes me strong is refusing to participate in the fiction that this company is healthy under your leadership. Jake, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, stood up. Everything in my last presentation was accurate. The market research, the projections, the strategy, it was all solid work that was dismissed because of personal animosity. Mark chose this moment to intervene, his voice dripping with false concern. Perhaps we should take a brief recess to collect ourselves? No, Tyler snapped, finally finding his voice. You want to air our dirty laundry, Sarah? Let's do it. Let's tell everyone how you betrayed, not just your husband, but the company itself. How you conspired with a junior executive to undermine leadership. The only person undermining leadership is you, Tyler, Sarah cut in. Your obsession with control, your inability to accept criticism, your need to dominate. Every situation, it's destroying everything we built. The shareholders' murmurs grew louder. One of them, Barbara Chun, stood up. Mr. Prescott, in light of these revelations, the board would like to call an emergency session. Tyler laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. You can't be serious. You're going to let a domestic dispute affect company policy? This isn't about the affair, Barbara replied firmly. This is about a pattern of behavior that's been brought to light. The hostile work environment, the dismissal of valid business strategies, the apparent prioritizing of personal grievances over company interests. Mark watched the scene unfold, his expression carefully neutral even as triumph surged through him. Years of waiting, of carefully documenting Tyler's worst moments, of quietly sharing concerns with key board members. It was all paying off better than he'd planned. I move for an immediate vote of confidence in current leadership, another board member called out. The room descended into chaos. Various factions formed instantly, those loyal to Tyler, those who'd long resented his leadership style, and those who saw an opportunity for change. Sarah stood in the eye of the storm she created, feeling simultaneously liberated and terrified. Jake moved to stand beside her, not touching but close enough to offer silent support. Tyler surveyed the room, seeing years of carefully cultivated power relationships crumbling before his eyes. His gaze landed on Mark, and for the first time, he noticed his friend's badly concealed satisfaction. "You," he said softly, realization dawning. "You've been orchestrating this." Mark's smile widened fractionally. "I merely provided a stage. The performers chose their own roles." The board members were now openly discussing emergency measures, their voices rising as they debated procedures and precedents. Tyler's world was collapsing in real time, his carefully constructed empire crumbling under the weight of exposed truths and long-suppressed resentments. The aftermath of Sarah's revelation rippled through Prescott advertising like a shockwave. Tyler found himself facing challenges from previously loyal executives who now sensed weakness. Walking through the office the next morning, he noticed how conversations stopped when he approached, replaced by pointed silence. In the executive lounge, a group of senior managers barely acknowledged his presence. Tyler caught fragments of their whispered conversation. Question his judgment if he couldn't see what was happening in his own marriage. Richard Martinez, head of client relations, intercepted Tyler before he could reach his office. "We need to talk about the Anderson account," he said, his tone lacking its usual deference. "They're expressing concerns about stability in leadership." "Stability?" Tyler's voice was sharp. "I've led this company through 3 recessions." "Yes, but perception is reality in our business." Richard held his ground. "They're worried about the personal dynamics affecting decision-making." Meanwhile, Sarah found herself navigating a different kind of scrutiny. Female executives who had previously treated her as merely Tyler's wife now approached her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Her bold stand had transformed her from accessory to actor in their eyes. Jake faced his own challenges. Walking into the design department, he found his team divided. Some viewed him as a hero who stood up to tyranny, while others saw him as an opportunist who slept his way into controversy. The Miller method, someone had scrawled on the break room whiteboard. Step 1, design. Step 2, seduce CEO's wife. Step 3, profit. Jake erased it without comment, but the message was clear. His professional reputation had been irrevocably altered. Mark observed it all from his office, strategically sharing information with board members. "Did you know Tyler rejected the sustainability campaign despite rejected returns of 40%? He would mention casually. "Personal grudge, apparently. Makes you wonder what other opportunities we've missed." The board called an emergency session that afternoon. Tyler sat at the head of the table out of habit, but the power dynamic had shifted palpably. Barbara Chin opened the meeting with characteristic directness. "We need to address the elephant in the room. This company's value has dropped 3% since yesterday's revelations." "A temporary fluctuation," Tyler dismissed. "Markets hate uncertainty, but they'll stabilize." "Perhaps," another board member interjected. "But our concerns go deeper than stock prices. We're seeing evidence of systematic decision-making based on personal vendettas rather than business merit." Mark cleared his throat. "I've compiled a report." He distributed tablets containing meticulously documented instances of Tyler's questionable leadership decisions. "You'll notice a pattern of rejecting profitable initiatives based on personal conflicts." Tyler scanned the document, his face darkening as he recognized Mark's long game. Years of casual conversations and seemingly sympathetic listening had been weaponized against him. "This is a witch hunt," he declared, standing up. "I built this company from nothing. Every decision I've made was yours to make," Barbara interrupted. "That's precisely the problem. We've enabled an autocratic leadership style that's becoming increasingly liability in today's corporate environment." Sarah, watching from her office, received a text from Jake. "Are you okay? This is getting ugly." She stared at the message, understanding that their personal choices had catalyzed a corporate revolution that was now beyond their control. The question wasn't just about their relationship anymore. It was about power, control, and the future of the company itself. Tyler emerged from the board meeting looking shaken. Making his way to his office, he found Mark waiting by his desk. "The board has concerns," Mark said, his voice carrying false sympathy. "They're suggesting a temporary leave of absence while they review leadership structure." "You engineered this," Tyler accused. "All of it." The whispers to the board, the documented patterns, probably even encouraged Sarah and Jake's relationship. Mark's smile was subtle but unmistakable. I simply created an environment where truth could emerge. The rest you did to yourself." As Tyler stood in his office, watching his empire slip through his fingers, he realized that his greatest enemy hadn't been Sarah's infidelity or Jake's ambition. It had been his own hubris, carefully documented and exploited by the man he'd trusted most. Eleanor Prescott's Upper East Side townhouse had always been a sanctuary for Tyler. Now, sitting in his mother's pristine living room, he felt like a schoolboy again, powerful in the world, but humbled before the one person who could see through his facades. "You're not sleeping," Eleanor observed, pouring tea into bone china cups. It wasn't a question. "The board has called for a restructuring vote," Tyler admitted, his voice hollow. "After 30 years, they want to modernize leadership." Eleanor settled into her armchair, studying her son over her teacup. "And Sarah? Have you spoken to her since the announcement? What is there to say? She humiliated me in front of everyone who matters." "Did she?" Eleanor's voice carried decades of gentle wisdom. "Or did she finally stop protecting you from yourself?" Tyler's head snapped up. "You're taking her side?" "I'm taking the side of truth, darling. Something you seem to have lost sight of somewhere between building your empire and forgetting why you built it in the first place." Meanwhile, across town, Jake sat in his small apartment, staring at his resignation letter. The cursor blinked accusingly on his screen, each draft feeling either too apologetic or too defensive. His phone lit up with another message from Sarah. "We nay. D to talk about what happens next." Next. The word carried impossible weight. His career at Prescott was effectively over. No matter how this played out, he'd always be the man who fell in love with the boss's wife. Other agencies would see him as a liability, a scandal waiting to happen. In her own space, Sarah faced similar demons. She'd moved into a hotel suite, unable to bear the penthouse's suffocating perfection. The room's generic luxury was a far cry from her carefully curated home, but it felt more honest somehow. Her phone buzzed with a message from Barbara Chen. "Board meeting tomorrow. Your presence is requested." This isn't just about Tyler anymore. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She'd struck the match, but the fire had spread beyond her control, consuming more than just her marriage. Back in Eleanor's townhouse, Tyler's facade finally cracked. "I don't know who I am without the company," he confessed, his voice breaking. "Without the power, without the control." "Then perhaps it's time to find out," Eleanor replied softly. "Your father built his empire on fear too. Look how that ended." Tyler remembered all too well. His father's heart attack at 58, alone in his office, surrounded by papers but no people who truly cared. "What do I do now?" he asked, feeling lost for the first time since childhood. "You begin again," Eleanor said simply. "But first, you must decide what kind of man you want to be, not just what kind of leader." Meanwhile, Jake faced his own moment of truth. Sarah had agreed to meet him at their coffee shop on Sullivan Street. No longer needing to hide, but somehow feeling more exposed than ever. "I can't stay at the company," he said as soon as she sat down. "No matter what happens with the board." Sarah nodded, having expected this. "And us? That's the question, isn't it?" Jake studied her face, seeing both strength and uncertainty there. "Are we real, Sarah? Or were we just a reaction to everything wrong in your life with Tyler?" "Does it matter?" she asked softly. "Whatever brought us together, we're here now. It matters because I love you," Jake said, the words carrying both joy and pain. "But I need to know if you love me or if you love what I represent, freedom from Tyler, from that life." Sarah reached across the table, taking his hand. "I don't know," she admitted. "I need time to figure out who I am without Tyler's shadow. Can you give me that?" The honesty hurt, but Jake appreciated it more than any comfortable lie. "Time is all I have right now," he said with a sad smile. "My career's in shambles anyway." As evening fell across New York, for people faced their own versions of uncertainty. Tyler, in his mother's house, confronting the man behind the power. Sarah, in her hotel room, rediscovering herself. Jake, in his apartment, rebuilding his future. And Eleanor, watching her son sleep on her couch like he had as a child, praying he would find his way back to himself. The final board meeting began in silent tension. Mark stood at the podium, presenting his carefully curated evidence of Tyler's mismanagement. Projected behind him were graphs, emails, and testimonials. Years of subtle manipulation crystallized into damning data points. "The pattern is clear," Mark concluded, his voice carrying false regret. "Personal grudges prioritized over business interests. Innovative ideas suppressed due to ego. A culture of fear that's cost us millions in lost opportunities and talent." Tyler sat still, watching his friend of 20 years methodically dismantle his legacy. The betrayal stung less than the recognition of its inevitability. He'd created this environment where loyalty was transactional, where everyone was either a threat or a tool. But just as Mark moved to deliver his final blow, a young IT specialist burst into the room, tablet in hand. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice shaking, "but you need to see this." She connected her tablet to the projector, and suddenly Mark's private emails filled the screen. The room fell silent as they read messages spanning years. Careful manipulations, orchestrated conflicts, deliberate sabotage. Mark's masterpiece of destruction revealed as a long con. "You engineered everything," Tyler said softly, understanding dawning. The tension with Jake, the whispers to Sarah, the leaked information to the board. "You weren't documenting my tyranny. You were creating it." Mark's composed facade cracked slightly. "You're missing the point. The company needed change," Sarah interrupted, standing. "But not like this. Not through more manipulation and lies." The board members exchanged glances, realizing they'd been played as thoroughly as Tyler had. Barbara Chen cleared her throat. "I believe we need to reconsider the scope of our investigation," she said carefully. "Perhaps the problem isn't just leadership style, but the entire culture we've created." Tyler stood, buttoning his jacket, a gesture so familiar it felt like muscle memory. But instead of defending himself, he surprised everyone. "You're right," he said simply. "All of you. Even you, Mark, though not in the way you intended." He walked to the front of the room, facing the board. "I built this company on the belief that power meant control. I was wrong." Sarah watched her husband, seeing something new in his stance. Not defeat, but perhaps its opposite. Acceptance. "I'm stepping down," Tyler announced. Not because of Mark's manipulation or Sarah's revelation, but because it's time. This company needs new leadership, new ideas, and a new culture. The room erupted in murmurs. Mark stood frozen, his carefully orchestrated coup suddenly derailed by its target's surrender. "But before I go," Tyler continued, "I have a proposal, one that might actually address the real issues, not just the symptoms." He outlined a new structure: distributed leadership, collaborative decision-making, transparent processes. The very things he'd resisted for years. "And to show I'm serious," he concluded, "I'm transferring controlling interest to a board-managed trust. No more single person with absolute power, including you, Mark." Hours later, as the dust settled and decisions were formalized, Sarah found Tyler in his office, packing his things. "That was unexpected," she said from the doorway. "I had a long talk with my mother," Tyler replied, not looking up. "She helped me see some truths I'd been avoiding." "And us." Tyler finally met her eyes. "There is no us anymore, Sarah. There hasn't been for a long time. I just couldn't admit it." Jake appeared behind Sarah, hesitant. Tyler acknowledged him with a nod. "Take care of each other," he said quietly. "And Jake, that sustainability campaign? It was good work. Make sure it happens." As Tyler walked out of the office he'd ruled for so long, he felt lighter. The weight of control, of power, of constant vigilance, it fell away with each step. Sarah and Jake watched him go, their hands finding each other's almost unconsciously. "What now?" Jake asked softly. Sarah squeezed his hand. "Now we build something new, something honest." And somewhere in the building, Mark sat in his office, staring at his exposed emails, realizing that in his quest to seize power, he'd ultimately helped destroy the very system that made that power desirable. The story ended not with a bang of revenge or triumph, but with the quieter victory of truth over power, of growth over stagnation, of love over control. And perhaps that was the biggest twist of all.